Hello, 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 everyone. It is time. It is that time. It is the final lecture for this class. Hopefully, you are as excited as I am. I feel like the final countdown should be playing in the background right now. That would be appropriate. Anyway, so, for this final lecture, we're going to talk about globalization. Now, this unit is going to be a bit different than the ones that we've talked about in the past, mainly because we're not talking really about history here. We're talking about the present. And when talking about the present, when talking about history from the middle of the stream, per se, meaning that you are surrounded on all sides by the current of history, it's a little difficult to emphasize the impact of a lot of these things because we don't quite know what the impact of a lot of these things is just yet. Things that we may think are wildly important right now, such as, global north and global south and intergovernmental organizations, may in the long run prove to be non-factors historically. And things that we don't even talk about in this unit may go on to be the most important details of history, of the 21st century. So there's plenty of room to talk about causes, but not much in terms of effects to talk about. Now, in terms of the subtitle there, making the world bigger and smaller at the same time, I wanted to just kind of quickly focus on this phrase. Globalization is an extremely complicated process. It is a process that has been going on since essentially 1492. At some times, that process moves faster. At some times, that process moves slower. Since the end of World War II, and especially since the end of the Cold War, that process has sped up incredibly. Our ability to integrate culture and politics and information and data and wealth from every corner of the planet has expanded exponentially in the past 20 years. And that's part of what's making the world bigger. At the same time, technologically, we've expanded our ability to overcome Mother Nature. We've created vaccines, we've created cures to pandemic diseases that helped regulate the population in the past. We've developed the technology to live in more and more expanding climates. So we're now able to put ourselves in parts of the planet where for thousands of years we weren't. So we are getting bigger. Our habitats are getting bigger. Our cities are getting bigger. Our impact on the environment is getting disastrously bigger. But at the same time, globalization is also making the world smaller. The world is more interconnected. It takes 12 hours to literally get from one side of the planet to another. And that capability has only existed since probably the late 1960s, early 1970s. You know, the best example that I can give you in terms of how technology has accelerated globalization and how it has made the world a smaller, more tight knit place is for roughly, I would say, 6,800 years, the most advanced, reliable, fastest form of communication that we as the human race could put together was riding on horseback. So, for almost 7,000 years of our existence, the best we could do was roughly about 20 miles an hour. And that was only for stints of a few hours at a time, because obviously horses need to eat and sleep and rest and recover. In the roughly 230 years since then, we now can move faster than the speed of sound. We have left Earth's atmosphere and landed on other celestial bodies. We now have the ability to move large amounts of wealth and people and goods thousands of miles around the globe in less than a day. The world is not physically, but at least culturally, economically, politically, getting much, much smaller. And at the same time, it's also getting smaller in terms of isolation. As globalization advances, different groups are pushing back against that globalization. They don't want to be part of an amalgamated world culture. They want to hold on to their cultural uniqueness. And they push back against that globalization in a lot of ways, sometimes violently. So, in terms of this unit, um, there's a lot going on, and a lot of it may seem important right now, and it may end up not really being important. By the time your kids or your kids' kids take this class, and however many years that is, we may be talking about something completely different in the 21st century. Globalization may be a passing fad, but for right now, it is the way of the future. So we're going to talk about it. Now, what does globalization look like? There's a number of characteristics of globalization that are pretty common worldwide. The first and probably most significant is the increasing rate of technological advancement, starting with the Industrial Revolution, but really accelerating after World War II, right? Politically, another really important concept of globalization is the use of soft power. This is the idea that large scale war, open combat between national and international powers is not feasible. Obviously, nuclear weapons play a large role in that, but even nuclear weapons aside, the destructive power of our technology has reached the point where large scale conflict between superpowers or international powers, even on a conventional basis, would be so incredibly destructive that the losses would outweigh any potential gains. One of the third characteristics of globalization is the global market capitalism or neoliberalism. Now, we've been talking about the globalization of trade since what, Unit 16, right? But with our ability to travel and communicate being what it is, the world is more interconnected. The world is more interdependent upon itself. The world is more integrated than it's ever been before. And factors that normally you would think would be completely disassociated with one another are incredibly relevant in this new, highly integrated global market. For any of you out there that are interested in this and want a really actually kind of fascinating read, I highly recommend the book Freakonomics. It's about, at this point, 10 or 15 years old, but it is a really incredible study of global market capitalism, and it will blow your mind the things that are now interconnected and integrated with one another. I mean, there's a single chapter that talks about how, production capacity in East Asia impacts test scores, reading test scores for third graders in Florida. And I mean, it's again, it's pretty mind blowing. So I recommend that book for those of you that are readers. Another big characteristic of globalization is international cooperation, and this goes hand in hand with the idea of soft power. And this takes on a number of different forms, especially because of our ability to communicate globally almost instantaneously at this point. So this takes on the form of international rights movements. This takes on the form of international economic or trade cooperatives. This also takes on the form of what we call IGOs, intergovernmental organizations. These are things like the United Nations. These are cooperative, voluntary organizations where the members agree to collaborate and cooperate in order to combine resources, combine political influence, and achieve their goals without force. Another part of globalization is also economic inequality. Since the end of the Cold War, especially, there has been a growing gap between the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor. A lot of that gap exists between what's known as the global north and the global south, commonly referred to as the first and third world. Um, Another characteristic of globalization, especially considering the fact that our population is growing at an accelerated, almost exponential rate, is environmental restructuring. We are changing the face of the planet, sometimes for good, sometimes for negative, but we are restructuring it at a rate that was not possible even 100 years ago. Um, Another aspect of globalization is global cultural syncretism, which you can look at one of two ways. As the world becomes more interconnected culturally and in terms of communication, cultures blend, cultures cross over. Um, the mixing of cultures creates new alternative forms of culture. And that's a wonderful thing in some cases. However, the downside of that is we're also in some places facing a cultural diversity problem where, because of global exposure and because of the fact that every culture is exposed to every other one on the internet and on satellite and on cable TV, that there are very few unique cultural enclaves anymore. There are very few groups whose culture is completely their own. Now, again, this is a process that's been going on for thousands of years since the first trade routes have opened. But again, since the end of World War II, and especially since the end of the Cold War, that process is accelerating rapidly. And then the final characteristic that we're going to talk about is the pushback. Um, Not everyone sees globalization as a necessarily positive thing, and there's many different ways in which people push back against globalization. Some of them political, some of them environmental, some of them cultural. But with something that is so massively changing the way that human beings live, there's obviously going to be resistance. People generally fear change, and globalization is a massive change when you consider how much it's altering the past several thousand years of human history.